Hi, so ING Carrie Uye Johnson Iche, Dakwakara Huaninje, and I'm here in Haines Junction, Dakwakara, and my guest today is Teresa Vander Meer-Chassé, and please introduce yourself.
Dine ke Ddhälh Nelnah Shansi, Nogle he Teresa Vander Meer-Chassé Shansi. Hello, my name is Teresa Vander Meer-Chassé. My Upper Tanana name is Ddhälh Nelnah, and I am a member of the White River First Nation of Beaver Creek, Yukon. And I'm calling in from Kwanlin, Whitehorse, Yukon today, traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Ta'an Quechan Council.
Oh, it's so great to have you here today. So tell us a little bit about what it is that you do.
Sure. So I am a full-time Upper Tanana curator and visual artist, and I work primarily in contemporary beadwork. I didn't start becoming a full-time anything until probably about 2018 is when I actually became self-employed. Prior to that, I, was starting to get training in, I worked at the Kwanlin Cultural Center. I worked at the Yukon Arts Center, getting trained in this kind of curatorial view, and I really enjoyed it. So I just kind of wanted to continue on with it, and I felt like being a freelance curator and dedicating my time to my work was something that I wanted to pursue.
And growing up, when did you start to realize that you had the gift of artistry in you?
Oh, goodness. Actually, music was my first passion. I actually really wanted to go into music, behind the scenes and things like that. But I have been beading since I was 8. My grandma taught me when I was very young. But every 8-year-old, nobody wants to sit there and bead for hours on end. So that kind of left me for quite a while until I went to university. And when I was at the University of Victoria, I was studying anthropology. So I actually have a background in anthropology. And anthropology is such a strange thing to study as an Indigenous person, because they're always looking at the other, they're studying the other, but I am the other. So it was a very stressful time of trying to understand where I am and how am I placed within anthropology. So that's when I started to take up beadwork to actually help calm me, reduce the stress and things like that. So I started to bead more in university. And in 2016, I have my first piece that I made. I made this piece in 2016. It's called The Shoe. And this is the first time I started to call myself an artist, was 2016. So, yeah.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And that's all beadwork on there?
Yeah, so the beadwork, it's not sewn beadwork. This was actually glued on. So I took each individual bead and placed it on with a skewer stick. And it's reminiscent of how they do beadwork in Mexico. But instead of adhesive, they use like a beeswax. So this is kind of where I started to just collect things that I found on the side of the road, because I found the shoe. There's no other pair, there's no pair. And I just started to bead it and kind of put an Indigenous voice onto these roadside garbage that I could find.
So what have you learned about your business during this pandemic? What's been the impact on your business?
Definitely vulnerability. I think every self-employed person has felt it at some point in their career, and I'm definitely feeling it now. Events, exhibitions, festivals, everything's been canceled that I generally rely on, especially in the summer months for income, especially with art. I like to go to like a little festival and sit there and sell my wares, and, I can walk away with quite a bit. And same with the curatorial side. A lot of exhibitions have been closed, or, galleries have been closed, so exhibitions aren't happening. So there's a big loss in the arts and culture sector right now. So I've learned that, this is a time of kind of confusion. It's a little unsettling. You have to really start to figure out, okay, what's our next step? Where do we go from here? How do I pursue this? So yeah, I'm learning a lot about being self-employed and I'm learning a lot of how I can present my work in a new way, to make sure that that continues on.
What's been your engagement with customers, like with Yukoners? How has that been happening lately? Because usually it would be at an exhibit or.
Yeah, everything's been online. I tell people this all the time, but so I curated the exhibition at Emerging North, at the Yukon Arts Center, sorry, called Emerging North, and it was set to open, and literally like a few days before the opening reception, the Yukon Arts Center decided to close because of COVID. So it was a big hit for me, because it was my first big art exhibition that I had curated. Like the main gallery is the biggest space, essentially in the Yukon, that you can really host beautiful pieces of work and things like that. So having the opening reception close and not even happen, I was just like totally thrown back. But the Yukon Arts Center, we did a video. As soon as it closed, they got me in there. We did a little curatorial video where we just kind of like walked around the room and spoke about the pieces. And then just recently, we were able to do an artist talk with 7 of the 8 artists that are in the exhibition. So my interaction is with people like you, like speaking to you, but not really having access to a full audience. Other than, you know, things like interacting on social media, Facebook, Instagram, having likes, comments, things like that. It's been very different from the usual way of actually seeing people face to face.
As a curator, you're a leader. You're kind of pulling together a vision of something that you want to say or a group of people want to say. So what are you learning about leadership in having to face closure and things like that?
Oh yeah, like I think the biggest thing right now is, for me, I really enjoy teaching. I taught at a couple of universities, and I love the engagement that we have, or the conversations that can be sparked when we're bringing up these discussions. So I think for myself during this whole time, it's always about teaching. We've talked about this before, but you know, there's lots of things like COVID-19 is happening, Black Lives Matter movement is happening, you know, Indigenous rights, conversations of Indigenous rights, sovereignty, all of these different kinds of things are happening all at once. And I really enjoy speaking towards them, and having a conversation, a two-way conversation where you know, somebody may not agree with me, somebody may not have the same viewpoint as me, but we can get to a place where there's mutual respect and understanding of these situations. And I think that's what I love. And I try to do that through my work, I guess, through the work that I present. I might not have, you know, created, you know, the beaded mask or anything like that for the COVID-19 to represent it. But I'm looking at different ways of, how do I do my work? Why do I do my work? And those are what's important for me to remember at this time. You know, I personally don't want to necessarily remember all of the grief that we've all been experiencing. Some people do want to mark that in time. I personally want to grow from it. So I've started to actually, create new works that aren't necessarily about it, but relate to it because it's part of my growth through this process.
And I think that's like one of the things that we've heard a lot in this podcast is take this time to learn, to sort of build your relationships, look at your connections, and then learn and adapt, right? Like to figure out and find new ways of sort of pushing what your business is and finding those spaces in between to fill. So could you talk a little bit, like, how are you thinking about your art a little bit differently? Like what's coming up when you're finding your creative spaces?
Yeah, sure. So my biggest one right now, you know, COVID-19 hit sometime in March, and my life as an entrepreneur was impacted. Like I said, the exhibition's closed. I had a solo exhibition in Victoria set. I was able to use a space to take video of my work, but no, I never actually got to interact with anyone in Victoria through that exhibition. So those things really started to impact everything. And I had to start thinking of, okay, what am I actually going to create during this time? And do I feel motivated enough to create? I guess, is a big part of it as well. I've talked about this openly, but I've lost 2 grandparents in April. And being struck with, a worldwide pandemic, the loss of 2 people very close to me, as well as, seeing the Black Lives Matter movement and the videos that have been posted, like so much grief. Everybody's going through it right now in one way or another. So I have to bring that back to me and my work. So a couple of things that I've done, and I have examples. Aha, I've come prepared. So these are earrings that I've kind of done before, and they're your basic kind of dangle beaded earring that a lot of people do. So this isn't anything new, and this is something that I made quite a few years ago now. But from this compared to this earring that I literally just made last week, so it's different. I'm starting to kind of approach my work in a different way. I'm using materials that I don't usually use in earrings and things like that, like this semi-precious stone. People really like hide. So I've started to interact with different things that I don't usually do, especially in small pieces. I generally don't put as much time as other artists into making the jewelry, but I did make as well this week this drumstick. And this is specifically just for me. And that's something that I've been engaging with during this entire experience in these last few months, is also taking the time to make for myself and my family. And I think that's really important as an artist because we don't, a lot of artists don't actually create stuff for themselves. That's something I've noticed, is they usually try to sell it, or they have an order and they have to fill it, but they don't actually keep some of their work. So this is mine. This is not anyone else's. And this is a style of beading. It's called peyote stitch, and I'm not very good at it. You can see, I don't know if you can see that, but the bottom here is a little ugly. Up here it's much nicer. And this just allowed me to practice a new form of beadwork while doing and creating something that's specifically for me. And I've talked about it before, but beadwork is definitely a way for people to take the time for themselves, actually be able to sit and breathe. I know a lot of beaders have taken up beadwork because it helps with trauma, going through trauma and things like that, helping reduce stress. I know when I'm teaching it, people say it's very meditative, they just kind of zone out. So I think that's kind of a big part of how my work is changing right now.
What advice do you have for emerging artists who are trying to find their voice or their space right now?
Yeah. keep creating. I've seen a lot of new emerging artists popping up on my social media, and I am so happy to see how much they're creating. I feel like they have an opportunity now to really engage with people that have been in the arts sector for so long. I myself, I don't even call myself a mid-career, but I'm kind of not emerging. I'm kind of in the middle. So I myself am still new to all of this and this process, especially being an entrepreneur. This is all, every year is a learning lesson right now, and it's only been 2 years. So I'm myself am learning, but for young emerging artists, please keep creating. I will try to get you into as many shows as I possibly can. That's a big goal of mine as a curator, is to have the young Indigenous voices particularly be included in the conversation in galleries and things like that, because I think it's a voice that is often missed and forgotten about or ignored. So it's definitely a big part of my career and what I enjoy. And so I just enjoy it. I love seeing young artists start to create, and even, people that aren't young starting to take up new activities, right? I feel like people may not have more time during this era, but they certainly are at home and they're getting bored. And a lot of people are picking up crafts and new activities that they haven't done before. They're building things that they wouldn't have before. I think those are really exciting things to see, because people are starting to understand what art does, and the importance of art to get us through all of these really intense conversations that are happening in the world right now.
Yeah, the art of protest, the art of changing the way we think about these things, right? Like there are the physical manifestations that we see out on the streets, and any protest that I've been a part of is artistry in action. That's where, like, there's so much to say in those spaces, and your art really does say a lot of stuff. Like your curation of what you do. Like, tell me a little bit more, or tell us a little bit more about what it is to be a curator.
Sure. I love being a curator. I was really pushed into, well, I wasn't even pushed into it. I just kind of naturally fell into curation. My grandpa built a museum in his backyard in Beaver Creek. It's called Bordertown Garage and Museum. You might know it. Some people might know it. And so he's been collecting for like 50 years. And his collection has just grown. And he's curated his collection into this museum and made a general store and this kind of stuff. And that I've always been around that. And sure, some of his stuff is junk. Other stuff is extremely valuable, especially to Yukon history. And I just really enjoyed that kind of space. I always love going to museums. I wasn't actually going to art galleries until quite recently. But I really enjoy just kind of being able to play around with the work. Curation is about how people view something. You're manipulating it in a way so you can get your point across, or you allow your audience to see it the work in a different light. So, for example, like the Emerging North exhibition, you walk in, there's the title, you turn to the left and you can see bits and pieces of different work. But the first work that you generally walk towards is probably Heather von Steinhagen's installation piece. And there's lots of color. It's a little darker because there's a video, but you're naturally kind of drawn into the space. And then you just kind of walk around the space. And I've kind of, a curator basically sets their mind on everything that an audience is going to see, and then tries to present that work so the audience actually fully understands, or at least understands most, of what the artist is trying to do with that work. I think that's a big part of it, is the curator is a translator. Because artists sometimes, they'll create this beautiful piece of work, then they'll write like 2 sentences of it. And I'm like, but you just told me an hour and a half of like how important this work is, but they summarized it into 2 sentences. The curator's goal is to portray what that artist is also speaking of that they might not have actually written down. So that's what curation is in a summary. Yeah.
That's great. That's really good. How are you kind of getting through the days? Like, what's been your wellness practice as, everything in your business model is evolving and changing? How are you keeping yourself grounded?
Yeah, it's definitely, like I said, beadwork is a way of calming oneself, like taking the time for yourself to just sit and be with you, because that kind of self-care is really important, I think, especially right now. You go on social media and there's one thing after another, and not to ignore it, but to understand it in a different light. I use beadwork as my as kind of my space, as my bubble, as I can forget about the world while I'm doing my beadwork. Sometimes it helps to just kind of re-energize yourself and be able to go back into the conversation the next time, or you know what I mean? Like, it just allows that time and space so people don't get burned out. A lot of Indigenous people, there's a saying that if you're born Indigenous, you're born political. And it's true because our very existence, our very identity is defined by the federal government in Canada. So Indigenous people always have walked around with a number, or, you know, like all these kind of, it's not even self-identity, it's identity that's been placed upon us. So we're always having to deal with these certain things. For myself, I have white skin, so I can walk into a grocery store and not be followed. But for my relatives that do have darker skin, they have to deal with racism head on every day. And that's why I believe that, you know, taking up something like beadwork, taking up an art form, allows people to just have a moment for themselves, just to breathe, and realize, you know, how are we going to approach things differently? That's the big question for, I think, the world right now. And it can relate to COVID, it can relate to Black Lives Matter, it can relate to anything. It's up to us to have the conversation of how we're going to move forward. How are we going to change? Because if we don't change, you know, history is repeating itself in many ways. But yeah, I believe beadwork is a really good method of dealing with and handling stressful situations like this, of unsure of where my business is going to go in the future and things like that.
Any aha moments for you over the past couple of months? Like anything that's kind of shifting your worldview?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's everything stacked on top of each other because it's a lot at once, right? These are conversations that I've had every day of my life, but it's always been, this conversation's happening on Monday, this conversation's happening on Tuesday. It's not all the conversations are happening every single day, all the time, 24 hours. That's what's become very exhausting. And it's starting to remind me a lot of why I was so exhausted in university. And there's this thing that I call cultural exhaustion, which is you're, because of who you are, you're often approached for questions of this or expectations of you have to respond in this way, or if you don't respond to something, you know, all this kind of pressures of because of your identity. And it really does exhaust you. Like you actually walk away really tired and fatigued. And that's what I've been finding in this moment right now, is just feeling constantly exhausted. So it's nice to go and sit in front of my TV and just sit and bead. And I'm thinking about the world. Sure, everything's happening in my mind, but I'm able to just take a moment to be in the moment, I think is the biggest part of this. You know, we can look at all of the negative things that are happening, but there's also good in everything that's happening as well. And that's something that I think people get blind to is, you know, there's celebration here. There's excitement, there's change. I love change. Change is a good thing, right? So that's kind of like, that was my big aha moment, was just the fact that there's so much happening and people are getting burned out quite quickly, myself included.
Yeah, it's certainly. I hear you. There's a lot. There's a lot happening, and there's this sort of like level of anxiety that just sort of sits with all of us, and then kind of keeps ramping up from time to time. But I loved that you talked a little bit about hope and change or adaptation. What would be like your vision for, you know, as we're adapting the Yukon economy as we come out of, you know, this sort of lockdown or shutdown that we've been in? What would your hope be for what we build together over the next couple of years?
That's a really good question. The biggest thing for me is I've always had concerns with Indigenous artists in Yukon being portrayed as kind of a commodity, as you know, we're just like a check mark, you know, off of people's list. That I want to change. I don't want to be the check mark anymore. I don't want to be the box that you have to check off, basically. I want to be somebody that people feel engaged with, that they feel comfortable coming to, but that they're not hesitant in hearing what I have to say, or what any other Indigenous person has to say, or whatever any other Black person has to say. You know what I mean? Like, that's something that I think Yukon struggles with. And I would love to see more of that type of support rather than, rather than seeing us as that commodity or as that tourist attraction, because we often are used as the tourist attraction because we make beautiful things, right? People are making regalia, people are making drums, they're making weird things like me with my beaded shoe. We're used as an attraction in many ways, but if we can have our voices heard and respected, I would love to see that. I think we're slowly moving there, but I definitely think that it's a good opportunity right now to rebuild, and I think a lot of people are doing that, rebuilding themselves, rebuilding their identity, rebuilding their businesses. Sometimes I myself have to think about that as well, of how am I presenting my work to audiences? How am I acting as a contractor? Things like that. It's very important. But yeah, I'd love to see those kind of things change in the Yukon.
So the last question is usually a song, a book, a podcast, a movie, something that you think people should take in, that's getting you through.
I came prepared. I'm so happy. I do have a couple books. These are the 3 books that I recommend for non-indigenous readers. I would recommend Indian Horse if you don't fully understand residential school and the experiences that residential school survivors had to face. Indian Horse is really good for that. However, I often find that reading this book, it wasn't meant and it wasn't written for Indigenous readers because it's so triggering. So that's something about this book, but I really enjoy it. Here's my next one, Marrow Thieves. I love Marrow Thieves. It's a great book. And this one you can read it. Anybody can read it, obviously. But it has such really good connection to Indigenous knowledge that as an Indigenous reader, I was picking up on things that non-Indigenous readers weren't. And I really enjoyed that aspect of this book. There's a lot of hidden meanings for both non-Indigenous and Indigenous readers. So that's something. And then to get more technical, Beyond Blood by lawyer Pamala Palmater. She wrote this book. It's pretty heavy stuff to get through, but this is for anybody that's interested in actually understanding why Indigenous people are often, frustrated or angry with the government and things like that. This really explains a lot about the Indian Act. I've even encountered people that in Canada, 3-, 4th generation Canadians that didn't even know an Indian Act existed. Those kind of basic ignorant things that some people just have, and they just don't educate themselves. So this is a really good intro to that kind of side of this world that we live in as Indigenous people. Beyond Blood really helps guide people into that conversation, I guess. But yeah, those are the 3 books that I highly recommend. They're all very good reads.
I like how you brought in a theme there, this sort of like worldview, right? So like you're talking about one book being written to sort of like anchor in or speak to a certain worldview. So a non-Indigenous worldview with the Richard Wagamese book versus like the Bone Marrow Thief, which you reflected like really spoke to you because it was written through a worldview that is internal to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe that links a little bit back to what you were saying earlier, or what we were talking about earlier about sort of business development in the Yukon and ensuring that the worldview of Yukon First Nations Indigenous people is reflected in what we build together.
Yeah, I think a huge thing that I've been noticing over the last couple of years, actually, because I've been working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, is that our worldviews are very, very different. And it's not on purpose, or it's not because one person is more ignorant than the other or anything like that. It's literally how we were raised. The words that people said, the concepts people, your grandparents passed along to you, things like that. They're very, very different. And it is quite difficult to explain sometimes to non-indigenous people, even non-indigenous with amazing intentions that are open and very eager to listen. Sometimes it's really hard to explain what is actually understood in my mind compared to theirs. And that's something that I've been struggling with in how to teach or like how to explain, at least not teach, but explain what that difference is. And, you know, it all comes down back to the connection that we have with our lands and where we come from. That is so integral to what makes Indigenous people Indigenous, that it's really hard to explain if that separation has already occurred. So I think that's the biggest thing that I struggle with personally in my work, in teaching, anything like that, is making sure that my worldview is understood enough that we can have this conversation. But sometimes the worldview does get complicated, and you know, I can't explain everything about what I've learned because I've learned everything since I was a child. But it's there and it exists. And I believe every Indigenous person has this. And, you know, people talk about it all the time. You know, when I say non-Indigenous, I'm referring to anyone that's not from North America to begin with, but everyone is Indigenous to somewhere. And I think that's really important to remember. People often forget that. Like, you know, especially like the Canadian identity thing confuses me, because for myself, I'm Upper Tanana, I'm Indigenous to here, and I'm also European. You know, my grandpa came from Netherlands, we're Frisian, you know, I'm French, you know, these kind of things, understanding that, yeah, I'm European in my ancestry as well. Like, that's powerful. I love knowing that. I love knowing where my family's from, rather than saying things like I'm a Canadian. What is a Canadian? You know, a Canadian's all mixed. But when we're talking about like Indigenous and Indigenous worldviews, I'm talking about mine that's from here, that's been passed on for, you know, God, 14,000 years, you know, to 20,000 years of history. And that's all been passed along. And that's a very long time to teach what, you know, how you can see the world. Basically, children are shaped to understand these things. And that's really hard to translate.
It is, but your art gets us, and your words get us a little bit closer to seeing, to being able to see our differences and love our differences and embrace our differences and strength.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, Cindy Cho, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to share this. And like I said, I love talking about these subjects. I'm very passionate about all of these subjects. So I always encourage people to reach out to me again if they ever want to speak, or if anybody's watching you know, whoever's watching this, if they want to learn more, if they want somebody to listen to them or to help them understand something further. I really enjoy those kind of conversations. So thank you for letting me speak my piece.
Oh, well, thank you. Nani Chichi. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.